the Foreign Office is too distracted by all of this peripheral nonsense, corporate bureaucracy, its woke excesses, and decided to resign. We're giving away sovereign British territory in the form of the Chagos Islands. We're not exactly covering ourselves in glory at the moment in the Middle East. I've also found it incredibly demoralizing and depressing, to see how ministers are being swayed by sectarian voting blocs back home. The Foreign Office needs to get back to looking at where the national interest lies and pursuing that, and relentlessly doing so.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined today by Ameer Kotecha, who has, having worked at the Foreign Office for 11 years, quit last week and wrote a blistering article about civil service dysfunction in the Times. Ameer, as I say, you were at the Foreign Office for 11 years. You were posted as a diplomat in Russia most recently. But I wondered if you could take people back to 2021 when Kabul is about to fall to the Taliban. What is on the minds of the senior civil servants at that particular moment?
Yeah, thanks, Fraser. And as you say, I did over a decade in the Foreign Office. My most recent posting was actually Tel Aviv. But before that, as you say, I was in Russia, where I headed up the British consulate there. Look, you ask about the fall of Kabul 5 years ago, with all of the implications that had for our national security here at home. But what was on the minds of at least some senior mandarins was World Afro Day, right? I did not realize we had a World Afro Day or needed one, but apparently there is such a thing. I receive an email along with several thousand other officials, not just in the Foreign Office, but across government, and inviting us to a panel discussion to celebrate World Afro Day. And there were senior officials taking part in this panel, including one charged with matters of national security. And I just sat there thinking, really? Is this what we should be focused on? So, that was 5 years ago, but it wasn't an isolated example. I mean, bringing it right up to the present, as I said in this Times article, last week, the main story on the Foreign Office internal intranet, and I think, what's on there is quite a good illustration of the sort of messaging that senior management want to be giving to the organization. The main story is not about the Middle East. It's about seizing your development and the latest corporate tool to do that. So my argument is that the Foreign Office is too distracted by all of this peripheral nonsense. It's internal navel gazing, it's corporate bureaucracy, it's woke excesses. And, eventually it wore me down. I decided enough's enough, and I decided to resign.
And I support you say that, you think it's too distracted by this stuff, because a lot of people might retort and say, well, it's important to have diversity initiatives. Do they really take up so much time? Shouldn't, what is it? Is it a fuss over nothing? But I think what you're driving at is that this actually gets in the way of the core mission of an institution like the Foreign Office.
Yeah, exactly. Look, as soon as you talk about DEI or woke excesses, you're always going to have a whole army of people come back and say, this is just culture war mudslinging, right? Actually, it's not about that. It's about being distracted by the peripheral and therefore not focusing on the core of what the Foreign Office is there for, right? And this stuff does have a cost. I mean, I would estimate that a third, maybe even half of the time of directors and directors general, the most senior officials in the Foreign Office, their time is spent on this corporate stuff. It's not necessary, and it has a cost, because it means that they are not thinking about, how we get ahead of the current Iran crisis, how we ensure that we're doing everything possible to defend the UK against, this belligerent Russian threat. So this stuff does have a cost. And if all was going swimmingly in the Foreign Office, I guess they could turn around and say, well, we can have our cake and eat it. But clearly things are not all going swimmingly well. As we can see, we're giving away sovereign British territory in the form of the Chagos Islands. We're not exactly covering ourselves in glory at the moment in terms of how we're responding to the current developments playing out in the Middle East. So, I don't think they can, the senior Foreign Office establishment can retort that things are going fine. I should just get back in my get back in my box.
And do you think senior mandarins have any sense of what Britain's national interest might be? You get the sense. Another thing you brought up in your Times article was perhaps like an over reverence or too much deference to international law, to human rights treaties. Not that those are necessarily bad things in and of themselves, but do you think that is hamstringing foreign policy to a certain extent, hamstringing governments, elected governments?
Yeah, I think it is, Fraser. So, not only are we distracted by all of this peripheral stuff that gets in the way of foreign policy making, but even when we are doing the foreign policy making, it feels to me as if our focus, singular focus, which should be on what's in the national interest, actually is being almost crowded out by competing considerations, right? So one of those absolutely is international law, right? I think we have an overly rigid, almost sort of straightjacketed approach to international law, and I think we saw on the Chagos deal that what the consequences of that are. I also think it's that same almost sort of worship of mindless, unquestioning worship of international law that has a bearing on other things, like how slow we were to defend our own sovereign base in Cyprus in the face of the drone attack from Hezbollah in recent days. So I think, yes, absolutely, international law and overly rigid interpretation of it is also getting in the way of the national interest. And look, I'm actually not one of those who thinks we should junk international law entirely, right? I do think it serves a purpose, but it serves a purpose when it makes for a more peaceful, stable world. And clearly, it's not doing that at the moment. And when it fails to do that, and when it actually sort of ostensibly requires us to do things that are clearly opposed to our national interests, like giving away our own sovereign territory, I think we should have the confidence to call it out, right? And we're not really doing that.
And I also just wanted to ask you about the kind of caliber of the staff in somewhere like the Foreign Office. I think, it might once have been said that at least these are people with great knowledge of the world or of their particular region, or subject matter expertise. But you read a lot of reports about people not even necessarily speaking the languages of the countries they're posted to, people being shifted around quite a lot. What's your experience of that? Are we are we the Foreign Office that should command respect as it might once have in previous decades?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, because every so often there'll be a story in the press, aghast at how few Russian speakers we have, or Mandarin speakers we have, but really that this is the sort of tip of the iceberg, and actually it's a sort of symptom of a deeper problem, which is that the Foreign Office and its structures do not incentivize building deep expertise, right? I think the public assume that there will be someone in the Foreign Office, or a group of people in the Foreign Office, who have been working on Iran for 20, 30 years and know that country, its culture, its history, its language absolutely inside out. I think they should expect that, we should have that. We are a great power, and our foreign service has a glorious history. There's no reason why we can't have that, but we don't at the moment, because the system we have, this generalist system, the sort of gifted amateur, and it stretches all the way back to the Northcote Trevelyan reforms. What actually we have is a system where every few years people move jobs. So and there's no rhyme or reason to it. You might do 2 years on the Iran desk and then get moved to the Brazil desk, right? Or similarly, if you're serving at an embassy abroad, you might do 3 years at the British embassy in, let's say, France, and then get moved on to the British embassy in Baghdad, right? It sounds a bit mad, and I think it is, but it's the system that we have, and for whatever reason, it's never really changed. So I think that is a really big problem. It sounds a bit nerdy, this is about foreign office structures and systems and incentives, but actually is absolutely crucial because it's one of the key reasons why the foreign office, I think, is failing.
And another sense you get from reading about the civil service as an outsider is that people who are talented, people who are hardworking are maybe sidelined, managed out, aren't treated especially well, whereas a lot of people who are kind of have been around for a long time, maybe don't work so hard, maybe work from home a lot, seem to be pretty secure in their jobs. Do you see that as a problem? Did you encounter that yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Neil O'Brien from the Tories actually came out with a good piece today talking about the lack of performance management in the civil service, right? He had a great stat, which was you're 12 times more likely to die in your job than you are to get sacked from it in the civil service, right? So, I mean, this is a really big problem. I mean, it's a sort of bit of a cliche that you don't get sacked from the civil service, but it's pretty much true. And it is a problem. People plod on even when they're not performing, even when they're not delivering results. And I think the reason behind it is this cult of kindness, right? There is an idea that to actually demand improvements in performance and ultimately to actually put someone on a performance management plan and potentially get rid of them, that would be insufficiently empathetic. It wouldn't be kind, it wouldn't be understanding. And this has an impact, right? And it's difficult. I mean, no one wants to see anyone lose their job, right? But as any private sector organization knows, if you don't get rid of the underperformers, it drags down the whole organization. And this is what we see, I think, in not just the Foreign Office, but in civil service departments generally, right?
And what blame do you think that politicians should shoulder? Are they perhaps not clear enough sometimes in their goals, whether that's on foreign policy or other policies? And could they not do more to reform the civil service? It seems as if that's something that's talked about all the time, but the can gets kicked down the road a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, ultimately, politicians, should carry the majority of the responsibility for this, right? I do think that we need to think about where senior officials, the most senior mandarins in the country, where they should also bear their degree of responsibility, because we have a very weird system in the UK where if you're an official, you're somehow immune from any sort of public accountability, it feels like, right? Which seems to me a very narrow, shallow form of political accountability, right? But I do think ultimately it's ministers, it's the politicians that are responsible. They could reform this system. I think there are some efforts, or some encouraging signs that there are politicians out there that get it. I think Danny Kruger, I think, is really prioritizing civil service reform, and I think that's quite encouraging. But he's not the only one. There are others as well. But it's absolutely something that ultimately the politicians are the political masters that act as every civil servant's boss. So they bear absolutely the highest degree of responsibility. And I would just say, I mean, it's not just politicians being distracted by international law. I think I've also found it incredibly demoralizing and depressing to see how ministers are increasingly on some areas of our foreign policy, like Israel-Palestine, being swayed by or the demands of their backbenchers and also, sectarian voting blocs back home, right? I mean, my final job in the Foreign Office, as I said, was in our embassy in Tel Aviv. And there, absolutely, we see our posture on Gaza, our relationship with the Israeli government is absolutely being determined by the demands of Labour backbenchers and, the pro-Palestine lobby group back in the UK, right? So that is, my argument is that is no way to conduct and determine a country's foreign policy. Foreign policy making should be an exercise in dispassionately looking at the world, deciding where the UK national interest lies and the best path to maximize that. And instead, it feels to me that we're being distracted from that singular focus on the national interest. It's actually almost playing second fiddle to all these other things, to these sort of corporate requirements, to the bureaucratic excesses, to international law and a very, very rigid, narrow form of it, and also to these sectarian demands and sectarian lobby groups. So, the Foreign Office needs to get back to looking at where the national interest lies and pursuing that, and relentlessly doing so.
Ameer Kotecha, thank you very much.
Thank you.